I will demonstrate to you in the next few minutes the interaction between the Esker platform and ERP X3. This is achieved through the interaction of a connector between these two platforms, which are the Esker platform for supplier invoice processing and all topics concerning X3 on customer invoices as well as purchase invoices. I propose to process a number of invoices. The first of these invoices that we will process is an invoice issued by the supplier Realdu. This invoice is one that arrives at the company in question. I enter the site code concerned by the invoice, and I indeed notice that the supplier has been automatically retrieved. The three little dots allow access to the Sage X3 reference data. There is no replication or synchronization of supplier records directly in Esker. The data is indeed stored in ERP X3. This invoice has been recognized by its number, the invoice number, the amounts excluding and including taxes. And at the level of entering the line items, we will be able to feed the general account, which is also stored in the ERP and directly accessible from the consultation form. The entry of the analytical allocation similarly follows the same constraints, namely that the entire reference system is indeed stored in the ERP. The VAT concepts that appear here, it's the VAT axis that comes from the ERP, directly accessible. In terms of the workflow, nothing particular stands out. I suggest removing the reviewer and keeping only the approver to see the evolution of the payment authorization. We are now ready to account for the invoice and materialize it directly in the ERP. Let's check the presence of this invoice, which is now in the To Be Approved tab, and we find the document number here. I will copy this document number and now go to ERP X3 to find the document directly in the supplier invoices. Let's find the accessible invoice here in the form of a customer invoice, as it is indeed a customer invoice generated by Esker. So the invoice appears here. We did create it directly in the ERP. We find elements that allow us to consult the document and access the document directly from Esker by clicking on the link. It's the URL link to view the document directly in the Esker interface. Additionally, we will find elements concerning the workflow, particularly the payment approval. We see that this invoice has not yet been approved. This is Alice's job that we will do in a few minutes to see the modification directly accessible from the ERP. We will now proceed with the approval by operator Alice. We are now connected as Alice, who must perform her approval work. This approval work will be done from the Esker interface by finding the document in question to be approved and of course approving the document directly accessible. She will proceed with the approval directly from the Esker interface. The approval will trigger a process that will update the payment approval status directly in the customer invoice generated by Esker. The invoice will then be accessible for payment via the financial elements of the ERP. Let's see in the ERP where this invoice is. The status of the payment approval of the invoice has now evolved, and we have the payment approval that has been updated by Alice as approver. To continue our example, I suggest we discuss another subject, which is working on an invoice with a purchase order that references commercial management elements. I now propose to address another example that I would like to present to you, namely an invoice with a purchase order that references commercial management elements. For this, our friend the accountant must process an invoice from a supplier called Indigo. Here it is, and this invoice, as we will see, refers to a purchase order that was received directly in the ERP. It is a PO invoice, a purchase order invoice. We find elements here. You see the purchase order number identified on the document. The three little dots allow querying the ERP on the fly and viewing the line items that make up this order. Note, this order was received in two parts. We see it here by the two receptions present, and the reconciliation mode has made both reception lines appear directly in these line items. Esker was able to bring back the line items directly into the interface to allow the accountant to operate a validation and compliance process between the right side, the invoice, and the items that make up the line items. So we have the first reception for 6 quantities and the second reception which concerns 4 quantities. The total is indeed 10, and there is consistency with what the supplier proposes with the two reception lines. We will therefore proceed, as with the customer invoice earlier, to the posting and approval by our friend Alice. Here the document will be sent to the ERP. Once posted, the invoice appears here in the invoices to be approved. We will identify and find this invoice directly in the ERP by going to the ERP and bringing the invoices back to the purchasing level. This invoice, unlike the one earlier, is indeed a purchase invoice. We find it here. It was entered in the same way. Here we find the payment approval elements that will be updated by Alice. We find the links that facilitate document consultation and find the link with Esker. We find the line items concerning the receptions that were generated and reconciled via the supplier invoice and the Esker module. We will proceed with the approval by our friend Alice. Here we are in Alice's context to approve a new invoice that now concerns this supplier called Indigo, who delivered us products. Here is the document in approval, of course, and I will proceed with its approval. The approval will trigger the update of the payment approval status directly in the ERP. Let's find the purchase invoice that has evolved in the payment approval updated by Alice's approval action. The last example I would like to address with you is an invoice from a supplier for which the supplier was not identified in the ERP. We see here the site allocation. The supplier is Esker, and when I query my ERP reference, this supplier does not exist. It is not present in the database. No problem. We will therefore create the supplier from the ERP, and we will thus see the interaction between the ERP and the Esker platform. Let's create the supplier. We reach the end of creating this Esker supplier. The record is well added to the database. I return to the Esker interface. I will query the supplier, and by clicking on the 3 little dots, I immediately activate the search, and we see that this supplier is immediately accessible directly from the Esker interface without synchronization. I can thus process the invoice directly from the module. We are at the end of this presentation, which aimed to demonstrate the interaction found between ERPX3 and the Esker platform through a connector that facilitates exchanges and allows write access both in the form of customer invoices and purchase invoices related to commercial management elements. Thank you.